Please welcome to the stage the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Finance for the Republic of Singapore, Lawrence Wong, and Editor-in-Chief of Bloomberg Editorial and Research, John Micklethwait.
Deputy Prime Minister, thank you very much for talking to us again.
Thank you, John.
I should explain to people who are not Singaporeans that you're here in two capacities. One is a member of the current government, Deputy Prime Minister, as we said, and the second is the anointed successor to Prime Minister Lee, and thus the expected next Prime Minister, assuming that the People's Action Party somehow manages to win the next election.
Indeed. We don't take that for granted.
Yes, I know. It's seemed to work quite well since 1959. I asked Henry Kissinger on this stage which Lee Kuan Yew, who began that process, which Lee Kuan Yew would be more worried about out of Russia, Ukraine, or US-China, and he said definitively US-China. And I wondered where you...
I'm not surprised at all.
Do you think anything has changed on that because of you come back from Bali, because of what Xi meeting Biden?
Well, it's very good that the leaders had an important and constructive meeting on Monday, but this is really just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. So we shouldn't have any illusions that this one meeting will change things overnight, because there has been such deep suspicions and distrust built up over so many years. And as the saying goes, trust is built in drops but lost in buckets. So now begins the long journey of building trust step by step and recognizing that there are still major differences between both sides, making sure that neither party takes any actions that will cause trust to be eroded very quickly. But for now, it's a good start.
And do you think, is there a logical next place for that to go? I mean, they talk about discussing things like climate change. Those are sort of the easy subjects in some ways.
But don't trivialize them, because I think these practical areas for cooperation are indeed important steps to building trust, as are the next steps of opening more channels of communication, which is happening, which is a very good thing, because you need that level of communication beyond the personal relationship at the very top. You need more channels of communication for trust to be built. And importantly, through these actions and interactions, hopefully, the development of some guiding principles or guardrails, so that both sides understand where the other's red lines are, what are some of the difficult issues, and they will have some basis to manage this very important relationship for the coming years.
Do you still see, you talked earlier about it's US and China sleepwalking into conflict. Is that still your worry? Do you think they've sort of woken up now?
We always worry. I mean, the good thing is that both sides have made very clear they do not want to enter into conflict, that they are looking at a new phase in their relationship where they want to manage differences, avoid competition from escalating into conflict. And that's positive. But as I mentioned just now, the fundamental differences have not changed. America considers China its strategic rival, and it has stated very clearly that it wants to not just have a lead in technology for 1 or 2 bounds, but an absolute lead, as far a lead as possible. And the more America takes action in that direction, the more China will feel, well, you are really just trying to keep me down permanently, to contain me, and that will elicit a reaction from China. So the risk of us moving into a more bifurcated and balkanized world still remains.
You're referring on that to the kind of chip war, so to speak, especially the recent Biden declaration, the new rules about chips, which make it very difficult for anyone to work with both America and China.
It's chips, it's technology, it's also trade and supply chains. On both sides, trade and technology, I think there are legitimate concerns around security. There are legitimate concerns about building greater resilience in the supply chain. But if you carry the arguments too far, then I think there will be many unintended and far-reaching consequences that will make all of us worse off.
Does that mean, when I was here last, it was very obvious, and they've said this publicly, but it was very obvious that Singapore, Indonesia, the region, took a very dim view of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Do you think it's the same thing about the semiconductor deal, that it's something that is seen as overly aggressive against China?
Well, like I said, we recognize that there may well be areas of legitimate security concerns. But you can make the argument that everything is dual use, really. And so how far does that go? I mean, if you can keep it and be very careful about defining your security interests and limiting these to areas of critical technologies where there are legitimate security interests, I think there will be more countries that understand America's position and will be prepared to support that. But once it gets more and more far-reaching, I think there will be concerns from many countries in Southeast Asia. And the same goes for dealing with supply chains. If there are critical dependencies in essential areas and there is a need for more diversification, well and good. I mean, all of us would support that. We constantly look at diversifying our import sources, which is why when our neighbors banned the export of live chickens to Singapore, we did not flap, because we've got many alternatives.
Very good pun, by the way.
For frozen chickens.
Yeah.
But diversification is not decoupling.
But you're in a strange position on the chip makers, because at least in principle you could imagine that Southeast Asia, this region, gaining because chip making is now going to move away from China and Taiwan.
No, so we can see why companies and investors might want to diversify their exposures in Asia and look at smarter diversification, look at setting up more manufacturing in Southeast Asia. Certainly many Southeast Asian countries will welcome that. But I think if diversification becomes decoupling and you have separate supply chains, different technology circles which cannot interact with one another, countries will have to choose sides, and no one wants to be in that position.
We'll come back to choosing sides in a second, but surely the world that you would inherit will be one where there's two tech ecosystems. There is an American ecosystem and there is a Chinese tech ecosystem, and you either have to keep a foot in both, or you can't sit in the middle.
There already is evolving two separate ecosystems in some critical areas of technology, but I'm talking about how this might become more pervasive across even, very straightforward matters of, because the entire technology supply chain is such a global network now. It's not like in the days of the Cold War. So if you're talking about a complete separation, nothing in my ecosystem can be made in another ecosystem. No single component at all. I think we are talking about a major separation which will not only impact Singapore, it will impact the whole world and companies everywhere.
But in terms of America, I mean, America keeps on coming to this region. We had Catherine Tai this week with this rather kind of wonderful argument that, will you come and join them in their non-existent trade pacts? How could America improve its
Don't be so cynical. No, we understand, as we've had this conversation before, we know the constraints of domestic politics in the US. We would like to have trade, we would like to have market access. It's not possible now. We encourage the US administration to keep these options open at a suitable time down the road. If the opportunity arises, do consider it. But meanwhile, there are many areas we can cooperate on around the green economy, the digital economy, supply chains, and including green financing and many things that America can do in Southeast Asia.
Do you think though that America is losing that part of the economic argument because it isn't coming? It has a group of countries, including Singapore, who are sympathetic to many of the more democratic parts of the American message, perhaps even a little bit scared of Chinese hegemony. And yet, as long as America keeps on coming back here without the kind of economic frameworks that you and other countries, perhaps other countries in this region more, because they're less developed,
sure,
it's making it hard for America to win that battle.
Which is why we have been a consistent advocate for America to strengthen its economic cooperation and put meat on the framework of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which they have introduced and implemented. It's a framework now, but it needs meat. And that means looking at each of the pillars of cooperation and pursuing concrete projects. And it is happening. The ministers have been meeting for 1 or 2 rounds, and I think there are some concrete projects that are being discussed. So it is promising. And there's something on the table. It's not just talk.
What about China? Do you see any change in China's attitude now that Xi has somewhat miraculously been elected to a 3rd term?
Well, I think both US and China have cleared some of the domestic politics that they had to go through, and for the Chinese Communist Party and for Xi Jinping, now that the party congress is over, they have consolidated, made very clear their new leadership team. They will be very focused on setting the direction for China's economy going forward. They have medium and long-term goals very clearly set out, but their immediate challenge is to get out of COVID-0 and deal with some of the very real challenges in the near term, including debt and property markets.
But in the past, certainly go back a year or so, there were kind of mumblings out of places like Singapore that China was overreaching. There was talk of trying to interfere in domestic politics, those sort of things. Now that Xi Jinping is more safely ensconced, do you think that might change?
It's hard to say. I mean, all countries, as they become bigger and more larger in size, more developed, look to become more assertive in their foreign policy and to assert their national interests. This is not unique to China at all. As a small country, Singapore experiences this all the time.
Something which would be unique, and which is certainly something which is on everybody's minds here, the chances of China invading Taiwan. What kind of odds do you put that at?
Well, President Biden made clear this after his meeting with Xi Jinping as well, that he didn't see any imminent threat of an invasion in the near term. And I think that's the readout we got from the meetings that they had. And we think that's the case because China and President Xi now have so many immediate domestic preoccupations. Why would they want to do something like this? But having said that, for China, Taiwan is a red line. And President Xi made it as clear as possible to President Biden. It's a red line. It's, in fact, the reddest of red lines, because for China, Taiwan is about sovereignty. It's about territorial integrity. So China cannot have America talk about 2 Chinas. There is one China, and after all, this was the basis of the 1972 agreement as well.
And do you think but isn't it one of those debates where you can see the different people? You can see America, China, Taiwan, the 3 main parties. They are all repeatedly saying they want to keep the status quo, whilst at the same time slightly salami cutting a little bit more. Each time they're just trying to change the debate slightly.
Which is why I mentioned at the start of our conversation that this is just the beginning of a long process. Because on China, indeed, everyone is saying the right things, but maneuvering for maximum advantage. And that's not helpful because accidents can happen, miscalculations can happen. And that's why it's so important for both sides to come together, sit down, have a clear understanding of where the red lines are, communicate with one another, and have that level of communication, not just at the very top, but across all levels, including amongst the military.
Your foreign minister's nice phrase about you could have overlapping circles of friends. Do you worry that you're heading towards a world where it's harder to have overlapping circles of friends?
We do. That's why we are very encouraged by this the conversation that took place between President Xi and President Biden. And that's why we think the lesson from Ukraine is not to wait till conflict happens. That's too late. The lesson is really to start thinking now about what can we do in Asia to develop a framework of cooperation that will maximize our chances for continued stability and prosperity. And to us, that means having a framework where we can have overlapping circle of friendships, where people can do business with many parties, and we want all the major powers to have stakes in Southeast Asia and to do business here in Southeast Asia.
One kind of consequence of what's happening at the moment is that people have been leaving Hong Kong and coming to Singapore, especially a lot of mainland Chinese money seems to be coming here. You have a vast number of family offices have grown. There's a lot of other things coming here. I know you will tell me immediately that Singapore has nothing but the best interests of Hong Kong at its heart.
We want them to succeed.
You want them to succeed, but for better or worse, you are getting a lot of their money. Now, if that money is coming here, it does cause you problems, though. It causes you worries about inequality. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. We will always keep Singapore an open economy. There is no alternative for us. After all, the whole basis of the Singapore story is one of the triumph of openness. And that's why it's so important, even existential, for us to keep ourselves open. But we know that there are downsides to an open economy, which is why the government is not, we are clear-eyed about the challenges, and we will deal with these downsides. The downsides includes dealing with making sure Singaporeans can have access to affordable housing.
Yeah.
The downsides includes looking at how we can ensure inclusive growth, dealing with income and wealth inequalities, and also continuing to invest in Singaporeans so that we give them all that maximum advantage to excel and do well in an open economy.
That's part of the problem, though, isn't it? You only have, you have a small amount of space. By definition, property values, rents. The rent is the most common word I have heard in Singapore these past 3 days.
Yes.
There is a pressure in that direction.
Yes. That impacts more the people,
foreign, yeah.
Foreign professionals who are looking to rent, but it does have an impact on competitiveness. But prices are also a concern with regards to affordability. Fortunately, we do have in Singapore public housing that caters to 80% of Singaporeans. We can keep prices affordable. But we monitor this very, very closely, the entire property market, as well as affordable housing for Singaporeans, because it's such an integral part of our compact. And because, as you say, Singapore is so small, and if we don't keep a close watch over it, we can easily, a lot of the foreign investments into property can easily bring about a huge problem for us.
The subject of imbalances and openness, one of the things Singapore has been very open to is crypto. And as you know, there have been one or two upsets.
We are open to digital innovation and digital asset innovation, but we are not open to crypto speculation at all.
You're one of the biggest crypto centers in the world, though, aren't you? You might call it digital money, but you're open to these things. You are the founder of FTX, took part in the Central Bank's FinTech Festival, taken part in Bloomberg festivals as well. But
yes.
What's happened the past couple of weeks in the crypto market, does that give you any cause for concern in that particular area?
Well, it has just reinforced our perception, our views that we were on the right track to go big on digital asset innovation, which is an important enabler and I think something that potentially can transform financial markets, cross-border payments, settlements, capital markets. A lot of potential there. But, and we've said this for a long time, even when people criticized us for saying that, which was that we need to take a strong stance against crypto speculation and trading, especially by retail investors. So we had put out, even before FTX happened, we had put out a consultation paper on tightening regulatory rules around this aspect, right? On crypto trading, on retail investors' access to crypto. We plan to tighten. We had put out a consultation paper and we will review the rules that are necessary. But we will continue to embrace innovation around digital assets, which we think has tremendous potential.
Do you see it as part of a kind of necessary shakeout for the crypto industry? It's part of the maturing of the crypto.
Partly, but in the FTX case, there are very serious allegations that amount to potential fraud even. So it's not just about its governance, it's a whole range of issues, and we'll have to see what happens with the investigations. But I think there was a bit of a bubble, and now we are starting to see some shaking out as well.
Can I ask you a bit about openness as well? You are the next face of Singapore, and you talked about Singapore being more open. It's famously open financially, a little bit less socially. The last time we were here, we talked about the laws on homosexuality being revised.
Yeah, we have a big debate on this later in Parliament.
And now that's gone through, but there are
Not yet. It's coming in Parliament at the end of this month.
But are there other things where you think Singapore could open up a bit further?
Sure. Well, there is no question that we are becoming a very diverse society, and there will be segments in Singapore with different views. People will desire more openness, socially as well. But because it's a very diverse society, the different segments in Singapore will value different aspects, including stability, security, the fact that the children can go out safely at night, and these are important things to them as well. So how do we balance between these different considerations? I think society will evolve and the government will continue to engage citizens and see how best to represent their aspirations.
Any chances, I just saw Thailand has just decriminalized cannabis. You take famously rather a tougher attitude. That would make your name.
I'm not out to make a name for myself. I'm here to make sure that Singapore continues to succeed and do well for many more generations to come.
Well, Lawrence, you have admirably done that. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for hosting the New Economy Forum here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you.